All right, here we go. Hi guys, Eric from Legend Suspensions here. Today we're going to be doing an install on this 2008 Dyna Street Bob. We're going to be installing one of our AXEO front cartridge systems. So I'm going to get started here, getting the front end off the motorcycle, and I'll take you step by step through the installation process. All right guys, we've got our forks off this Street Bob and got them chucked in our Motion Pro pivot vise here. We're going to start disassembling them, getting the stock internals out, and getting them cleaned up and getting ready to install the AXEO cartridges. One of the first things that I will touch on is when you do actually open your stock forks up, we always like to start with removing the bottom bolt first. That will actually get the oil draining from the fork leg itself. And then when we get to the point of releasing or removing the top cap, make sure that you have a good hold on that thing, as well as have some eye protection, maybe even some hand protection on, because there is a lot of spring force loaded in that top cap or under that top tube, and could do some serious bodily damage or harm. So at this point I'm going to take and get this bottom bolt, lower rod bolt removed from the leg. Like I say, that's going to get the oil draining out. You're going to retain your stock lower rod bolt, as well as the crush washer that is on that bolt, because we will be reusing it. One of the things that you can also take into consideration when you're doing your forks is that depending on how many miles are on the motorcycle, you may or may not actually need to go inside and replace the seals and the bushings and so on and so forth. This bike just has a little over 17,000 miles on it. So as you can see, the fluid is nice and clean and clear. So we don't have a lot of heavy metallic in the oil. That's a pretty good indicator that we don't need to go inside. Along with that, that's a 50,000 mile service interval on those. So we're still about 35,000 miles short of that service interval for seals and bushings. So at this point, I think what we'll do on this one, as with any of them, definitely purely situational, but we're just going to take and get the stock internals out of these forks, clean them up real good, and put the cartridges in. So now that I've got that oil draining, if you give the slider a couple of pumps, that'll usually get the oil distributed to the bottom side of the slider, and we'll continue to drain that. And now we'll go to removing the top cap. Like I said, this is one of those spots where there's a lot of preload on this fork. So when you go to remove it, you're going to definitely want to be able to shield the top from that spring flying out, and put a shoulder into it. That way you ensure that that top cap isn't going to fly across the shop and knock a hole in the wall. So you're going to remove the stock preload spacer, stock preload spacer out of there, along with the main spring and the lower rod and stock top out spring. The lower rod seat is going to stay in the lower leg. It will not come out unless you physically separate the upper and lower slider and the upper tube. And that's good because we will be reusing the stock lower rod. Our lower rod seat, or alignment cup as we refer to it quite often. One of the questions that we get quite often is, why do you send an extra lower rod seat with the Dyna kits? So this kit being the 04140512, which fits all 2006 to 2017 Dyna models with the exception of a couple in that line, come with just one lower rod seat. And that is specifically for the situation on 2016 and 2017 Dyna Lowrider S models. On the 2017 and 16 Lowrider S models, they come with a factory cartridge in the left-hand leg. That factory cartridge, once it is removed, you will also have to split the upper and lower and actually take the factory lower rod seat out of that left-hand leg and put the lower rod seat that we provide with the kit in that left-hand leg. Along with that, you will also have to get a new factory lower rod bolt to match the one in the right-hand leg. But that's the exception and the reason for that extra lower rod seat. So at this point, we got the fork draining there. We're gonna take and give this thing a few little pumps to get the excess oil out.
Okay, too fast. Everyone, we need to pump at a pace of 100 beats per minute.
Oh, okay.
We're gonna give it a little shot of brake cleaner just to rinse the residue out of the leg. All right, so I'm gonna just give this thing a nice dousing of brake and electric parts cleaner. Get the old residue rinsed out of the fork leg here, since this one is a prime candidate for not having to replace bushings and seals. This is gonna get a little loud, so. All right, so at this point, we're going to set the preload on our cartridges based off of the chart on the back of the installation guide. When setting preload on AXEO cartridges, whether it's for the FL models or in this case, our Dyna, we always want to take into consideration the rider weight only. Do not take passenger or luggage weight into consideration, because the majority of the weight of the passenger and luggage are being handled by the rear suspension. So, that said, the customer that owns this bike is about 180, 185 pounds, dressed and ready to ride. So this cartridge comes set out of the box for a rider up to 250 pounds, so it does not require any adjustment per se from as a technician or as a customer installing this particular set. But in this situation where if you were 275 pounds, 375 pounds, then you would make the adjustment according to the preload chart on the back of your installation guide. One thing that we always want to do is make sure that our set screw on our preload adjuster is locked down. So in this case, I'm not going to make any adjustments, but I am going to take this preload adjuster and just give it a little dab of blue Loctite on the threads, and then thread it back in and snug it against the machined flat surface on the actual shaft of the cartridge there. This will ensure that the preload doesn't change or shift while it's riding. One other question that we'll get from time to time from our customers is, I've got two cartridges of identical length, but I notice that maybe there's a difference in the spring length or the adjusted length of our preload adjusters. And the one reason for that is completely due to the tolerance, the manufacturing tolerances on the springs. The manufacturer of our springs has a plus or minus tolerance that they can produce their springs within. So that being said, it's not uncommon to set a group of springs on the table, and you may have 5 springs on the bench or on the table, and all 5 of them are just going to be a little bit different length. So if you see a difference in where your preload adjuster is set, just bear in mind that it is due to the difference in spring tolerance lengths based on the manufacturer that we get our springs from. Nothing to be concerned about. The cartridge and the front end is still going to ride great. It's just a little bit deceiving. Thankfully, it's inside the fork tube, so no one's going to question it once it goes in. Okay? So at this point, we've got our fork tube cleaned out, rinsed out, ready to drop a cartridge in. The one thing that you will want to make sure of before you drop the cartridge in is the factory lower rod seat that is in the lower leg is basically positioned to accept the cartridge. And when it is positioned correctly to accept the cartridge, it's going to basically sit just like a cup. The opening will face up. As the cartridge comes in, it will drop into that cup just like so. So we've got our lower rod seat positioned to accept the cartridge. We're going to take one of the top out springs that is provided with the kit, drop it in the top of the upper fork tube, and then we're going to take and drop our cartridge in. On that, we'll bring the lower slider up to match up or mate up with it. Little dab of blue Loctite on the lower rod bolt. And we're just going to run this in to snug it, and we'll do our final torque on it. A little bit here. Probably inside the bolt. Like so. Now at this point, we can take and swing our fork leg back to the vertical position. And we'll take and put some oil in this. This particular front end setup requires 12.5 ounces per leg. So we'll take our Maxima oil that came with the kit. Take our trusty little ratio right. I'm gonna go just a little over 12 ounces there. There is a little bit of cling factor built into those numbers. So if you don't know exactly what 12 ounces is and you are at 13 ounces, you're gonna be okay. It isn't quite as scientific as that. So like I say, there is a little bit of cling factor built into what's left in the cup. So at this point, we're gonna take and slowly pour the oil in. A little bit of a time-consuming process on some models. This one isn't too bad, just because you got enough space between the tube and the cartridge to actually get the oil poured in there, but you'll definitely want to still be patient, because if you get a little too overzealous, you can have a little bit of a blowback and it'll actually burp oil out of the tube before you actually get it all the way full. So take your time getting your oil in there. Once you get it poured in, one of the most common things that we see guys doing is they think that they need to pump the cartridge, and that actually isn't doing anything that we want. What we always want to do is we want to take and grab the lower slider and actually take and pump that lower slider, and that's going to get the oil distributed from the bottom or from the upper tube into the lower slider, and nice and slow, about 10 to 15 slow pumps of that, and that will ensure that the oil is distributed to the slider. And the other thing that it will do is it will ensure that you've got all the oil or the air bled out of the oil. When you first start pumping it, you'll actually, if you have your ear down by the fork tube, you'll hear it'll almost sound like someone is gargling in the bottom of that fork tube.
It's go time.
That means you've got a lot of air trapped in the bottom there. As you start to pump this slowly, you'll actually hear those big air bubbles leaving, and it'll start to sound more like a bowl of mushy Rice Krispies. That's a good sign because you don't want any air trapped in that oil. Air trapped in the oil will give you a harsh ride effect, and it'll actually feel like you've got more preload built into the front end than you actually need. So we'll take and do this, like I say, about 10 or 15 short, slow strokes. One thing that I always like to do is at the very end, you can take and push through the hydraulic bump stop at the end, and you can actually feel that resistance when you get to that point. And that's actually a good sign that everything is functioning properly between the upper and lower tubes. So at this point, we've got the air bled from the oil. I'm going to take and thread this into our upper tube. And we'll come back and do a finished torque in just a minute. Okay, so we got our oil poured in, oil's bled. Gonna just torque the top cap and the lower rod seat to make sure that we've got everything tight and right. Good to go. So at this point, we've got the first fork leg done, and we'll go on to the second one here. I always like to leave these as close to vertical as possible. That way we don't tip the oil that we've just bled from the upper tube into the lower tube. So with that said, I always like to keep them as vertical as possible until I get them back on the motorcycle. So just a quick tip and note there. So we'll move on to the second leg now and repeat the process. All right guys, so we just finished installing our AXEO cartridge in our second fork leg. So at this point, we're ready to reinstall them on the motorcycle and put them back together. All right, so we're ready to bolt our forks back onto the street bob here. Go through and give you a few little pointers as far as what we do here at Legend to help you out along the way, but for the most part, it's a pretty straightforward reinstall. So at this point, I'm going to grab my left-hand fork leg. We always start with the left-hand fork leg, and I'll show you why here in just a few minutes. So, first thing we always do, we always take and we'll set our left-hand fork leg in the triple trees first, and we'll set it off the stock tube height. So just so you got the top of the cap protruding through the top of the triple tree, along with just a little bit of the silver tube, as you can see in that shot there. One of the biggest things that we always like to do, especially on the Dyna models, is index it so the logos on the top caps are actually straight. Since these are exposed, there's no sense in having your stuff all janked up. Take a few extra seconds, line everything up so it looks aesthetically correct. And that way the guy sitting behind the controls looks at it and goes, hey, sweet, that looks great. Rather than, boy, I wish that guy would have taken an extra 2 minutes to line my stuff up because it looks like a third grader did it. So at this point, we've got our left-hand leg locked in the triple trees. Now, rather than actually setting the right-hand leg at the same height, what we're going to do is we're actually going to set the right-hand leg into the triple trees as well. But one thing we're going to do, I'm just going to snug this for a second while I actually thread this axle cap on, because we'll actually take and set our fork tube heights in our triple tree based on our front axle. We want to make sure that that axle slides through the axle holder and into the other leg with zero resistance. That lets you know that everything is lined up and you don't have any bind or resistance because the legs are offset. So I'm just gonna get that axle holder started on there. I'm actually gonna get this front wheel out of the way for a second here. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna run this through. And as we can tell, my fork tube isn't even protruding through the top of the trees here. I'm gonna loosen this up, give it a little bit of a wiggle. So at that point, we know that we've got a real nice float on that axle. There's zero resistance. Slides through both fork legs, real nice and easy. And lastly, up on top, we'll adjust our Legend logo so it looks aesthetically correct. Take and lock that thing in place as well. Axle still moves nice and free through both legs. At this point, it's pretty much business as usual. We'll go through, we'll torque our upper and lower triple tree bolts, get our turn signals mounted back in place, and then we will button this thing up and take it for a ride. So sit back, enjoy the ride, and if I run into any other high points along the way, I will stop and let you know. All right, guys, just finished up reassembling the front end on this street bob. We're about ready to roll it off the lift. One of the last pieces of advice that I'll always give you before you take and put the weight of the motorcycle back on its wheels and the front wheel is in the air, make sure you reach up, grab that front brake before you roll it off the lift to make sure that you've got the brakes pumped up. That way your customer doesn't leave with no front brakes, or you roll off the lift without any front brakes and pile into the bike behind you. So outside of that, like I said, bike's all buttoned up, ready to drop this thing down off the lift and take it for a ride. Hopefully this guy will help you guys out with any of your future installs when it comes to our Dyna products, and especially our AXEO front end products. If you do run into any questions along the way, please email us at service@legendsuspensions.com. Thanks and enjoy the ride.